In the thin air, where most people can barely breathe, where every step feels like carrying twice your weight, and where the margin between life and death shrinks to nothing, 13 trained professionals had already failed. 13 attempts. 13 defeats against a mountain that had claimed more lives than anyone wanted to count. The rescue helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its pilot radioing the same message that had echoed across the peaks for the past 18 hours. No clear shot. Repeat, no clear shot possible. 4,000 meters above sea level, on a ledge no wider than a dining table, Marcus Chun clung to life with fingers that had lost all feeling 3 hours ago. Below him stretched a drop that would end everything in seconds. Above him, an overhang of ice and rock that had defeated every rescue attempt since dawn. The world's best mountain rescue teams had tried everything. High-altitude specialists from Switzerland had failed. Elite climbers from Nepal had been forced to retreat. Even a legendary rescue squad from Chamonix had admitted defeat after their 13th attempt nearly cost them 2 more lives. But sometimes when all the experts have given up, when all the training and experience and million-dollar equipment have proven useless, the answer comes from the most unexpected place. Her name was Sarah Nakamura, and until that morning, no one at base camp even knew she was there. While the rescue commanders shouted orders, and the media crews set up their cameras to document either a miracle or a tragedy, she sat quietly on a supply crate, watching everything with the kind of stillness that most people mistake for doing nothing. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been studying the mountain face for 7 hours straight. While others saw only impossible angles and deadly drops, she saw something else entirely. Something that would either save Marcus Chen's life or add her name to the mountain's growing list of victims. The clock was ticking. Marcus had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia, and exhaustion would make any rescue impossible. 13 attempts had failed, but the 14th was about to begin, and this time wasn't going to be led by any of the experts. Sarah Nakamura had been sitting on the same supply crate for 7 hours, and most people at base camp had stopped noticing her entirely. She preferred it that way. While rescue coordinators barked orders into radios and journalists pushed microphones toward anyone willing to talk, Sarah remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on a mountain face where Marcus Chen fought for his life. The rescue operation had started before dawn when Marcus's climbing partner, David Rodriguez, stumbled into base camp with frostbitten fingers and a story that made everyone's blood run cold. They had been attempting a new route up the north face when an avalanche struck without warning. David managed to dive behind a rock outcropping, but Marcus wasn't so lucky. The snow carried him down 200 feet before he caught hold of the thin ledge, and there he remained, trapped 4,000 meters above sea level with no way up or down. He's conscious, but hurt bad, David had told the rescue coordinator, his voice shaking from more than just the cold. Left leg looks broken, maybe internal injuries too. The ledge is maybe 3 feet wide, and there's nothing but air below it for 1,000 feet. Every time he tries to move, more ice breaks off. Within an hour, the mountain rescue operation had transformed base camp into something resembling a military command center. Teams arrived from 3 different countries, each bringing their own equipment, their own methods, and their own certainty that they could succeed where others might fail. The Swiss team arrived first, their red and white helicopter cutting through the morning mist like a knife. They were followed by a group from Nepal, men whose fathers and grandfathers had been rescuing climbers from these peaks for generations. Finally came the French team from Chamonix, legendary for their success rate in impossible situations. Sarah watched each attempt with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything else in her life. She was supposed to be here as a wildlife photographer, documenting the effects of climate change on high-altitude ecosystems. Her assignment had nothing to do with mountain rescue, but she found herself unable to look away from the drama unfolding on the cliff face above. The first rescue attempt began at 8 in the morning. The Swiss team tried to rappel down from above, but loose rock and unstable ice made their approach impossible. Every time they got within 50 feet of Marcus, their movements triggered small avalanches that threatened to knock him off his already precarious perch. After 2 hours, they admitted defeat and pulled back. The rock structure is too unstable, their team leader explained to the growing crowd of media and onlookers. Any pressure from above causes cascade failures in the ice formations. We're putting the victim at greater risk by attempting a descent from above. The Nepalese team tried a different approach. They attempted to climb up from below, using the same route that Marcus and David had taken earlier. But what had been challenging in good weather became impossible in the aftermath of the avalanche. New cracks had opened in the rock face, and the route that had taken Marcus and David 4 hours to climb was now impassable. After 3 attempts that nearly cost them 2 team members, they too were forced to retreat. The mountain has changed, explained Pemba Sherpa, the team's lead climber, as he coiled his ropes with obvious frustration. What was solid yesterday is broken today. The avalanche has made the whole face unstable. We cannot reach him from below. By noon, the situation had attracted international attention. News crews from major networks had somehow made it to base camp, their satellite trucks and camera equipment creating a bizarre contrast to the raw wilderness surrounding them. Helicopters circled constantly, some carrying reporters, others bringing in additional rescue equipment, and a few attempting direct rescue approaches themselves. The helicopter rescue attempts were the most dramatic failures of all. The thin air at 4,000 meters made flying difficult, and the mountain's weather created unpredictable wind patterns that could slam a helicopter into the rock face without warning. The first pilot, a veteran with 20 years of mountain rescue experience, managed to hover within 30 feet of Marcus before wind shear forced him to abort. The second attempt came even closer, but a sudden downdraft nearly sent the helicopter crashing into the cliff. "I can't get stable enough for long enough," radioed the pilot after his third failed attempt. "The wind is too variable, and the victim can't reach the rescue line from where he's positioned. If I try to get any closer, I risk crashing and killing everyone." Sarah listened to each radio transmission, watched each failed attempt, and slowly began to form a picture of the problem that none of the rescue teams seemed to be seeing. They were all approaching this as a technical challenge, trying to apply standard rescue procedures to a situation that required something different entirely. Each team brought impressive equipment and years of experience, but they were all making the same fundamental assumption about how the rescue should proceed. As the afternoon wore on, the failures mounted. The French team tried using drones to deliver supplies and equipment to Marcus, but the wind made precise maneuvering impossible. They managed to get a thermal blanket and some energy bars to within a few feet of his position, but Marcus couldn't reach them without risking a fall. The sight of life-saving supplies hanging just out of reach, swaying in the mountain wind, was almost worse than having no supplies at all. The temperature was dropping as the sun moved across the sky, and everyone knew that time was running out. Hypothermia would set in soon if it hadn't already, and exhaustion would eventually make it impossible for Marcus to maintain his grip on the ledge. The rescue coordinator, a man named Colonel Bradley, who had overseen mountain rescues on 3 continents, was beginning to make the calculations that no one wanted to think about. "We need to consider that this rescue may not be possible," he told the assembled team leaders in a voice barely above a whisper. "At some point, we have to weigh the risk to additional lives against the probability of success." It was at this moment, as the experts began discussing the possibility of abandoning the rescue effort, that Sarah finally stood up from her supply crate. She had been silent for so long that her movement caught several people by surprise. She was not particularly tall or imposing, and her photography equipment marked her clearly as an outsider to the rescue operation. But something in her manner, a quiet confidence that seemed immune to the panic swirling around her, made people pause and pay attention. "I've been watching," she said simply, her voice calm and clear in the mountain air. "I think there might be another way." The rescue coordinator turned toward her with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but we have some of the world's best mountain rescue specialists working on this problem. Unless you have specific expertise in high-altitude rescue operations, I need to ask you to step back and let the professionals handle this." Sarah nodded politely, but she didn't step back. Instead, she reached into her camera bag and pulled out a detailed topographical map of the area, one that she had been marking with careful notations throughout the day. "I'm a wildlife photographer," she said, "which means I spend a lot of time studying animal behavior and movement patterns in difficult terrain. Animals often find paths that humans overlook because we're focused on the most obvious routes." She spread the map on a nearby table and pointed to a series of markings she had made in pencil. "Every rescue attempt so far has focused on reaching Marcus directly, either from above or below or from the side. But there's another approach that no one has considered. About 200 meters to the east, there's a narrow ridge that connects to the same rock formation where Marcus is trapped. It's not visible from base camp because of the angle, but I've been watching it through my telephoto lens all day." The Swiss team leader, a man named Klaus who had been involved in mountain rescue for 15 years, studied the map with obvious skepticism. "Even if such a route exists," he said, "it would require crossing extremely exposed terrain to reach it. And we have no way of knowing if it's stable or if it actually connects to the victim's location." Sarah pointed to her camera, which was equipped with a lens powerful enough to count individual rocks on the cliff face. "I've been documenting the terrain for my research project. I have detailed photographs of every approach angle, including several shots of the ridge I'm talking about. It's narrow and exposed, but it's solid rock, not ice. And it definitely connects to the same ledge system where Marcus is trapped." She pulled out her camera and began scrolling through the images she had taken throughout the day. The photographs were remarkably clear, showing details of the mountain face that would be impossible to see with the naked eye from base camp. As she clicked through the images, a route began to emerge that none of the rescue teams had considered. "The approach would have to be made from the east side of the mountain," she continued, pointing to the map. "It's a longer route, and it would require crossing some exposed sections, but the rock is solid and the angle is manageable for an experienced climber. Once you reach the ridge, you could traverse horizontally to Marcus's position without having to approach from above or below." Colonel Bradley studied the photographs with growing interest, but his expression remained skeptical. "This is all very interesting, Ms. Nakamura, but even if this route exists and is viable, we don't have anyone available who knows that part of the mountain well enough to attempt it safely. All of our team leaders have spent the day focused on the direct approaches from this side." Sarah looked around at the assembled rescue teams, at the expensive equipment, and the confident expressions that had been gradually replaced by frustration and defeat throughout the day. Then she looked back at the mountain, where Marcus Chun continued his solitary struggle for survival on a ledge that seemed increasingly like his final resting place. "I know that route," she said quietly. "I've been photographing wildlife in this area for 3 weeks. I've climbed sections of that ridge system several times, and I know the rock conditions and the potential hazards. If someone needs to guide a rescue team along that approach, I can do it." The silence that followed her offer was profound. Rescue coordinators looked at each other with expressions that ranged from surprise to outright disbelief. This quiet woman who had spent the entire day sitting on a supply crate was now volunteering to lead a rescue mission that professional mountain rescue teams had deemed impossible. Klaus was the first to speak, and his tone was not unkind but was absolutely firm. "Ma'am, with all due respect, mountain rescue is not the same as wildlife photography. The margin for error is zero, the physical demands are extreme, and the consequences of failure are fatal. We cannot allow a civilian with no rescue training to participate in an operation like this." Sarah nodded calmly, as if she had expected this response. "I understand your concerns," she said, "and I'm not suggesting that I attempt the rescue myself, but I am suggesting that I could guide someone who does have the necessary skills along a route that might actually work. The alternative is to abandon the rescue entirely, which means Marcus dies." She paused, letting this harsh reality settle over the group before continuing. I've been watching your teams work all day, and they're all exceptional, but they're all trying to solve the wrong problem. They're focused on overcoming the obstacles that make the obvious routes impossible instead of finding a route that avoids those obstacles entirely. Sometimes the solution isn't to be stronger or more skilled or better equipped. Sometimes the solution is to approach the problem from a completely different direction. Colonel Bradley found himself studying this woman more carefully. There was something in her manner, a complete absence of bravado or false confidence, that suggested she was not making this offer lightly. She had spent the entire day observing and analyzing while others had been acting and failing. Her offer was not born of impulsiveness or heroic delusion, but of careful study and rational conclusion. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Sarah pointed to the map again, tracing the route she had identified with her finger. "I propose that one skilled climber, someone light and fast who can move efficiently across exposed terrain, makes the approach along this eastern ridge. I would guide them to the starting point and provide route information based on my observations and photographs. Once they reach Marcus, they can assess his condition and establish whether evacuation is possible along the same route." She looked around at the assembled team leaders, meeting each pair of eyes directly. "This isn't about proving anything or playing hero. This is about the fact that Marcus Chun is going to die if something doesn't change in the next few hours. I found a route that might work, and I'm willing to help implement it. The question is whether anyone is willing to try something different when all the conventional approaches have failed." The rescue coordinator looked at his watch, then at the mountain where shadows were beginning to lengthen as the sun moved toward the horizon. Time was running out, not just for Marcus, but for any rescue attempt at all. Night operations in these conditions were virtually impossible, which meant that if they were going to save him, it had to happen in the next few hours. As the rescue teams huddled together to discuss Sarah's proposal, she returned to her supply crate and began checking her equipment. Win or lose, succeed or fail, the quiet observer was about to become something very different. The 13th attempt had failed, but the 14th was about to begin, and this time it would be guided by eyes that had seen what everyone else had missed. The debate among the rescue teams lasted 23 minutes, and Sarah could hear every word from her position near the supply cache. The voices rose and fell in multiple languages, but the core arguments were the same in any tongue: professional responsibility, liability concerns, and the fundamental question of whether a wildlife photographer could contribute anything meaningful to a mountain rescue operation. Klaus led the opposition, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had pulled dozens of people off mountains across Europe and Asia. "This is not a nature documentary," he argued. "This is life and death. We cannot gamble a man's life on untested theories from someone with no rescue experience, regardless of how observant she might be." But it was Pemba Sherpa who surprised everyone by speaking in Sarah's defense. The Nepalese climber had been quiet since his team's failed attempt to reach Marcus from below, but now he stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that comes from growing up on mountains that kill the unprepared. "I've been watching this woman all day," Pemba said, his English careful but clear. "She does not speak unless she has something worth saying. She does not move unless she has reason to move. This is not the behavior of someone who makes decisions lightly." He paused, looking toward the mountain where Marcus clung to life. "And she is right about one thing. The conventional approaches have failed. All of them. If we continue doing what we have been doing, the man dies." The French team leader, a woman named Marie Dubois, whose reputation for innovative rescue techniques was legendary in mountaineering circles, studied the photographs that Sarah had taken throughout the day. The images showed details of rock formations and potential anchor points that would be invisible to anyone working from base camp without telephoto equipment. "The route she's identified does appear to be viable," Marie admitted, though her tone remained skeptical. "The rock formations look solid, and the exposure, while significant, is manageable for an experienced alpine climber. But The question isn't whether the route exists. The question is whether we can execute a rescue along that route with someone who has never participated in a high-altitude rescue operation. Colonel Bradley had been listening to the debate while studying weather reports and calculating the remaining daylight hours. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. They had perhaps 3 hours before conditions would make any rescue attempt impossible. Marcus had been exposed to sub-freezing temperatures for more than 8 hours, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of bringing him down alive. "Here's what we're going to do," the colonel announced, his voice cutting through the ongoing debate. "Ms. Nakamura will guide a small reconnaissance team to the eastern approach she's identified. If the route proves viable and safe, we'll proceed with a rescue attempt. If it doesn't, we'll abort immediately and return to base camp." He turned towards Sarah, his expression serious but no longer dismissive. "This is not a full rescue mission. This is reconnaissance only. You'll be accompanied by experienced climbers who can assess the technical challenges and determine whether a rescue is feasible along your proposed route. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Sarah nodded without hesitation, though she felt her heart rate increase slightly as the theoretical became real. "I'm prepared. I know the route, and I know the conditions. If it's possible to reach Marcus, this approach gives us the best chance." The team selected for the reconnaissance mission was small and elite. Marie Dubois would lead, bringing 15 years of experience in technical mountain rescue. Pemba Sherpa would provide expertise in high-altitude climbing and route assessment, and Sarah would guide them to the eastern approach that only she had identified and studied in detail. They departed base camp at 2:30 in the afternoon, carrying minimal equipment to maximize speed and mobility. Sarah had packed her camera gear not for documentation, but for the telephoto lens that would allow them to assess conditions and potential anchor point from distance. Marie and Pemba carried rescue equipment sufficient for immediate medical aid, but not enough for a full evacuation, since the primary mission was to determine whether evacuation was even possible. The initial approach took them away from the main climbing routes, following a path that Sarah had discovered during her wildlife photography work. She led them along a series of rocky ridges that paralleled the main mountain face, gradually gaining altitude while staying well away from the avalanche zones that had made the direct approaches so dangerous. "How did you find this route?" Marie asked as they navigated a particularly narrow section of ridgeline. The path was solid and safe, but it was completely hidden from base camp and from the main climbing areas of the mountain. Sarah paused to check their position against the topographical map she had been marking all day. "I've been tracking a family of snow leopards for my research project," she explained. "They use these ridge systems to move between hunting territories without exposing themselves on the main faces. Animals are excellent route finders because they always choose the path that offers the best combination of efficiency and safety." The comparison might have seemed absurd under different circumstances, but as they continued along the route that Sarah had identified, both Marie and Pemba began to understand what she meant. The path avoided exposure to rockfall zones. It provided solid footing even in areas where ice had formed, and it gradually approached Marcus's position from an angle that no human rescuer had considered because no human had been watching the mountain with the patient intensity of a wildlife photographer. After 90 minutes of steady climbing, they reached the point where Sarah's proposed route would begin its final approach toward Marcus's location. From this vantage point, they could see the ledge where he had been trapped for the past 10 hours, though he was not visible from their current position. Pemba studied the remaining route through his binoculars, assessing the rock quality and potential anchor points with the expertise of someone whose family had been guiding climbers in the Himalayas for 3 generations. "The rock is solid granite," he reported, "better than what we were working with on the direct approaches. The angle is exposed, but manageable, and there are good possibilities for protection placements." Marie was examining the same route from a rescue perspective, looking for places where an injured person could be safely moved and where equipment could be positioned for an evacuation. "It's definitely doable from a technical standpoint," she concluded. The question is whether Marcus is in good enough condition to participate in his own rescue. If he's unconscious or severely injured, moving him along this route could be extremely dangerous. Sarah had been studying Marcus's ledge through her telephoto lens, watching for signs of movement or distress. "He's moved 3 times in the past hour," she reported. "Small movements, shifting position to stay warm, but he appears to be conscious and responsive to his environment. His positioning suggests he's protecting an injured leg, but his upper body movement looks normal." The reconnaissance team spent another 30 minutes studying the approach and the potential evacuation route, taking detailed photographs and making careful notes about anchor points, exposure risks, and the technical requirement for moving an injured person along the route. By the time they were ready to return to base camp, they had developed a comprehensive plan for what would either be a successful rescue or a carefully documented failure. The return journey to base camp took less time than the outbound trip, since they were descending and following a route they now knew well. But the weight of responsibility grew heavier with each step. They carried with them the knowledge that Marcus Chun could be saved, but only if everything went perfectly in an environment where perfect execution was rare and mistakes were typically fatal. Back at base camp, the assembled rescue teams and media crews could see from their expressions that something had changed. The reconnaissance team had left with skeptical hopefulness, but had returned with the quiet confidence of people who had found a viable solution to an impossible problem. "The route works," Marie announced without preamble. "It's exposed and technically challenging, but it's solid and it provides access to the victim's location. We can mount a rescue operation immediately." Colonel Bradley had spent the intervening hours coordinating with helicopter teams and medical personnel, preparing for multiple contingencies depending on what the reconnaissance team discovered. "What do you need?" he asked. Marie began outlining the requirements for the rescue attempt. "We'll need a 3-person team. 1 lead climber to establish the route and reach the victim, 1 technical specialist to manage the evacuation systems, and 1 person who knows the approach route intimately." She looked towards Sarah. "Ms. Nakamura will need to be part of the team. No one else knows the route well enough to guide the operation safely." This statement triggered another round of debate among the rescue coordinators, but the tone was different now. The reconnaissance mission had proven that Sarah's route was viable and that her observations were accurate. The question was no longer whether she should be involved, but how to manage the risks of including someone without formal rescue training in a life-or-death operation. Klaus, who had been a most vocal opponent of civilian involvement, surprised everyone by volunteering to be part of the rescue team. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we need the best possible combination of technical expertise and route knowledge. I'll handle the technical aspects of the rescue. Pimba can manage the evacuation systems, and Ms. Nakamura can guide us along the approach that she discovered." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she realized that her quiet observation had evolved into direct participation in a high-stakes rescue operation. She had spent her career photographing animals in remote locations, often working alone in challenging conditions, but she had never been responsible for someone else's life in such immediate and dramatic terms. "I understand the risks," she said, meeting the eyes of each team member. "I also understand that this may be Marcus Chen's only chance. I'm ready to do whatever is necessary." The rescue team gathered their equipment as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. They would have perhaps 2 hours of good light for the most technical sections of the rescue, and night operations would be dangerous for everyone involved. The window of opportunity was narrow and closing, but for the first time since the rescue operation began, they had a plan that might actually work. As Sarah checked her gear one final time, she thought about the quiet morning when she had planned to spend the day photographing snow leopards and documenting the effects of climate change on high-altitude ecosystems. Instead, she was about to attempt something that would either save a man's life or add her name to the mountain's list of victims. The 13th rescue attempt had failed because it had followed conventional thinking and standard procedures. The 14th attempt would succeed or fail based on the observations of a wildlife photographer who had spent 7 hours watching a mountain while everyone else had been trying to conquer it. Time was running out, but the unlikely alliance of professional rescuers and quiet observer was ready to attempt what no one else had been able to accomplish. Marcus Chin's life hung in the balance, suspended 4,000 meters above the world on a ledge that had defeated 13 previous rescue attempts. The rescue was about to begin. The rescue team left base camp at 4:15 in the afternoon, moving with the focused efficiency of people who knew that every minute mattered. Sarah led the way along the eastern approach route, her movements confident and economical after 3 weeks of exploring these ridges in pursuit of snow leopards. Behind her, Klaus and Pemba followed with the measured pace of professional mountaineers, their equipment distributed for optimal balance between speed and preparedness. The weight of responsibility felt different this time. During the reconnaissance mission, Sarah had been guiding experienced climbers who could assess risks and make their own decisions about safety. Now she was leading a team toward a man who would live or die based on the choices they made in the next few hours. The theoretical had become urgently real, and she found herself checking and double-checking every decision about route finding and risk assessment. How far to the transition point? Klaus called from behind her as they navigated a particularly narrow section of ridgeline. The transition point was where Sarah's approach route would meet the rock face where Marcus was trapped, and it represented the moment when their mission would shift from route finding to technical rescue. Sarah consulted the GPS unit she had been using to mark waypoints throughout her weeks of photography work. "Approximately 45 minutes at our current pace," she replied. "The route becomes more exposed in the next section, but the rock quality is excellent, and there are good anchor opportunities." They climbed steadily through terrain that would have been considered challenging under normal circumstances, but felt almost routine given the stakes involved. Sarah's route followed natural lines of weakness in the rock, taking advantage of ledges and cracks that provided secure footing while avoiding the loose scree and unstable ice that had defeated the earlier rescue attempts. As they gained altitude, radio communications with base camp became intermittent due to the mountain's interference with radio waves. Colonel Bradley's voice faded in and out as he provided updates on Marcus's condition from the helicopter observations that continued to circle the cliff face. "Victim still conscious and responsive," came the crackling transmission. "No significant movement in past 30 minutes, but thermal imaging suggests he's maintaining core body temperature. Weather window remains stable for approximately 90 minutes." The weather window was crucial because mountain conditions could change with terrifying speed, especially as evening approached. Clear skies and manageable winds could transform into whiteout blizzard conditions within minutes, making rescue impossible and trapping the rescue team in the same deadly environment that had claimed Marcus. After 30 minutes of steady climbing, they reached a point where the eastern approach route began to curve toward the main cliff face. From this position, they could see Marcus's ledge clearly for the first time, though he remained just a small figure against the vast wall of rock and ice. More importantly, they could see the technical challenges that would define the next phase of their mission. "There's a crux section," Klaus said, studying the route through his binoculars. He was referring to the most difficult part of the climb, a traverse across exposed rock face that would bring them within reach of Marcus's position. About 60 meters of exposed climbing, but the rock looked solid, and there are obvious anchor points. Pemba was examining the same section from the perspective of evacuation logistics. Moving an injured person across that exposed traverse would require careful planning and flawless execution, since there would be no margin for error and no opportunity for second attempts. "We can establish a fixed line across the traverse," he concluded. "Set solid anchors at each end and, in the middle, then use that system to bring him across. It will be slow, but it will be safe if the anchors hold." Sarah listened to this technical discussion while studying Marcus through her telephoto lens, watching for any signs that his condition was deteriorating. She had spent weeks observing wildlife through the same lens, learning to read subtle signs of stress, injury, and behavioral change. Now, she applied those same observational skills to a human being whose life depended on accurate assessment. He's favoring his left leg heavily, she reported, but his upper body positioning looks strong. He's been shifting position regularly to manage cold exposure, which suggests good mental awareness and decision-making ability. I think he's in better condition than we feared. This assessment was crucial because the rescue plan required Marcus to participate actively in his own evacuation. If he were unconscious or severely injured, moving him across the exposed traverse will be exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. The team reached the base of the technical climbing section just as the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that photographers loved and mountaineers feared. Golden light meant the sun was moving toward the horizon, and darkness would bring temperatures that could kill an exposed person within hours. Klaus began preparing for the lead climb across the traverse, checking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone whose life had depended on such preparations hundreds of times. He would establish the fixed line system that would allow them to reach Marcus safely and provide the infrastructure for his evacuation. Once I reach his position, I'll assess his injuries and determine the best approach for moving him, Klaus explained as he tied into the rope system. The traverse looks manageable for someone with full mobility, but we may need to modify our approach depending on his condition. Sarah found herself in the strange position of watching a rescue operation that she had initiated but could not directly control. Her role was largely complete once she had guided the team to this position, but she remained the only person who knew the full route and the only one who could guide them safely back to base camp once the rescue was complete. Pemba established the first anchor point, a solid placement in a crack that would hold several tons of force if necessary. The anchor would serve as the foundation for the entire rescue system, and he tested it repeatedly before declaring it ready to support the operation. "Anchor secure," he announced. "Klaus, you're good to go." The lead climb across the traverse was technically demanding, but not exceptionally difficult by the standards of professional mountain rescue. Klaus moved steadily across the exposed rock face, placing intermediate anchors and establishing the fixed line system that would allow the rest of the team to follow safely. Sarah watched his progress through her telephoto lens, but she found herself increasingly focused on Marcus, who was now clearly visible on his ledge. After 10 hours of exposure to mountain conditions, he looked remarkably alert, though she could see signs of exhaustion and cold injury in his posture and movements. "Marcus," Klaus called out as he approached the final section of the traverse. "My name is Klaus. I'm with Mountain Rescue. Can you hear me?" The response was immediate and clear, audible even from Sarah's position 60 meters away. "I hear you," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse but strong. "I've been waiting for you guys all day." The sound of his voice, the first direct communication between rescuer and victim after more than 10 hours of desperate effort, sent a wave of relief through the rescue team. Marcus was conscious, coherent, and apparently capable of participating in his own rescue. Klaus completed the traverse and reached Marcus's ledge just as the sun began to touch the western peaks. The golden light that photographers treasured would last for perhaps 30 more minutes before fading to the deep blue twilight that preceded mountain darkness. "What's your condition?" Klaus asked as he secured himself to the same anchor points that had kept Marcus alive throughout the day. "Left leg is definitely broken," Marcus replied, "and I think I've got some cracked ribs on the same side. But everything else works fine. I've been doing exercises to stay warm and keep my circulation going." Klaus began a rapid but thorough assessment of Marcus's injuries, checking for signs of hypothermia, internal bleeding, or other conditions that could complicate the evacuation. The medical evaluation was crucial because different injury patterns would require different evacuation techniques. Broken tibia, probable fibula fracture as well, Klaus reported over the radio to the team and to base camp. Some rib damage, but no obvious internal bleeding. Patient is alert and oriented good core temperature, capable of assisting with evacuation procedures. We can proceed with the planned extraction. The next phase of the rescue required establishing a complex rope system that would allow Marcus to be moved safely across the exposed traverse despite his leg injuries. Pemba began setting up a sophisticated pulley system that would distribute his weight across multiple anchor points while providing mechanical advantage to move him horizontally across the cliff face. Sarah found herself with little to do during this technical phase except monitor conditions and maintain radio communication with base camp. But as she watched Klaus and Pemba work with the fluid efficiency of professionals who had performed similar rescues many times, she realized that her contribution had been essential but different from theirs. The professional rescuers brought technical expertise, equipment, and experience with the mechanical aspects of moving people safely through dangerous terrain. But they had needed her observational skills and route-finding ability to identify an approach that made their expertise applicable to this specific situation. Neither element would have been sufficient alone, but together they had created a solution to what had seemed like an impossible problem. "Sarah," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly across the gap between his ledge and her position. "Are you the one who figured out how to reach me?" She was surprised that he knew her name or her role in the rescue, but radio communications had been keeping Marcus informed of the rescue progress throughout the day. "I just found a different route," she called back. "These guys are doing all the hard work." Marcus laughed, a sound that seemed impossibly normal in the dramatic setting of a high-altitude rescue operation. "Well, thank you for being stubborn enough to keep looking when everyone else gave up. I wasn't ready to die on this mountain today." The rope system was nearly complete, but the light was fading rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Klaus and Pemba worked with increased urgency, knowing that completing the evacuation in darkness would be exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. "We've got maybe 20 minutes of good light," Klaus reported. "Let's get 'em moving." The evacuation itself was a masterpiece of technical mountain rescue, with Marcus supported by multiple rope systems as he was moved carefully across the exposed traverse. Despite his injuries, he was able to assist with the process, using his arms and uninjured leg to help control his movement while the mechanical systems managed his weight. Sarah documented the evacuation with her camera, partly for her own record-keeping, but mostly because she wanted to preserve the moment when theoretical possibility became life-saving reality. The images showed Marcus suspended against the mountain face, supported by ropes, and guided by rescuers whose silhouettes were stark against the deepening sky. The most difficult moment came at the midpoint of the traverse, where Marcus had to transfer from one rope system to another while suspended hundreds of feet above the valley floor. The transfer required perfect coordination between all team members and absolute trust from Marcus that the systems would hold his weight. "On 3, release your grip on the first line and grab the second line," Klaus instructed. 1, 2, 3. The transfer was completed smoothly, but Sarah found herself holding her breath until Marcus was securely attached to the new rope system and moving again toward safety. Each phase of the evacuation brought new risks and required new decisions, but the route she had identified continued to provide the stable foundation that made the technical rescue possible. By the time Marcus reached the relative safety of the main ledge where the rescue team had established their base, the sun had set completely, and they were working in the blue twilight that preceded mountain darkness. They had succeeded in the most difficult phase of the rescue, but they still had to navigate the complex route back to base camp while carrying an injured person through challenging terrain. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked Marcus as the team prepared for the evacuation back to base camp. "Like I just got a second chance at life," he replied, his voice strong despite the exhaustion and cold exposure of the past 11 hours. "And like I owe that second chance to someone who saw what everybody else missed." As they began the careful journey back toward base camp, Sarah realized that her role as a wildlife photographer had prepared her for this moment in ways she had never anticipated. Watching and waiting, seeing patterns that others missed, understanding how animals moved through difficult terrain. All of these skills had converged in a single afternoon to make the difference between life and death for a stranger she had never met. The 14th rescue attempt was succeeding where 13 others had failed, not because of superior equipment or greater courage, but because someone had been watching with different eyes and had seen what everyone else had overlooked. The evacuation back to base camp began in the deep blue twilight that mountain climbers know as the most dangerous time of day. Visibility was limited, but not yet gone. Temperatures were dropping rapidly, and every decision carried amplified consequences because retreat was no longer an option. Marcus Chun was alive and conscious, but he was also injured and exhausted after 12 hours of exposure to mountain conditions that had pushed him to the edge of survival. Klaus had fashioned a makeshift splint for Marcus's broken leg using climbing equipment, but moving through the technical terrain that lay between them and base camp would require careful planning and flawless execution. The route that had seemed challenging but manageable during their ascent now felt exponentially more complex with an injured person who needed assistance with every step. "We're going to move slowly and deliberately," Klaus explained to the group as they prepared to begin the descent. "Marcus, you'll be roped between Pemba and myself at all times. Sarah will lead because she knows the route better than anyone, but she'll move at whatever pace you can sustain safely." The row configuration was more complex than anything Sarah had used during her wildlife photography expeditions. But the basic principle was simple. Marcus would be supported by 2 experienced climbers who could arrest his fall or provide assistance if his injured leg gave out. Sarah would guide them along the route she had discovered, but the technical safety management would be handled by professionals. The first section of the evacuation route took them back across the exposed traverse where Klaus had reached Marcus earlier. But moving in the opposite direction with an injured person created new challenges that hadn't been apparent during the rescue itself. Sections that had been straightforward for a healthy climber became complex obstacles that required creative problem-solving and careful rope management. "How are you doing, Marcus?" Pemba asked as they completed the first difficult section. The question was not just polite conversation, but a crucial assessment of their patient's condition and endurance. Evacuation plans had to be constantly adjusted based on the injured person's ability to participate in their own rescue. "The leg hurts, but everything else feels fine," Marcus replied, though Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. 12 hours of cold exposure and stress had taken their toll, but his mental acuity remained sharp and his determination was obvious. "Just tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it." As they continued along the route, Sarah found herself viewing familiar terrain with completely different eyes. Sections of ridgeline that had seemed unremarkable during her photography expeditions now felt like potential disaster zones where a slip or fall could have catastrophic consequences. The responsibility of guiding an injured person through challenging terrain was unlike anything she had experienced in her career of solitary wildlife observation. The route that had taken 90 minutes during their initial approach was requiring more than twice that time for the evacuation, partly because of Marcus's limited mobility, but mostly because of the extreme care required to ensure his safety. Every anchor point had to be tested, every step had to be considered, and every decision had to account for the possibility that Marcus might not be able to recover from even a minor mistake. "Sarah," Klaus called from behind her as they negotiated a particularly tricky section of rock scrambling. "What's the most challenging section still ahead of us?" She consulted the mental map she had developed during 3 weeks of exploring these ridges, thinking through each section of the route and evaluating how Marcus's injuries would affect their ability to navigate safely. "There's one steep descent about 30 minutes ahead," she replied. "It's not technically difficult, but it requires good leg strength and balance. After that, the route becomes much easier." This information was crucial for planning their energy expenditure and managing Marcus's condition. If the most difficult section was still ahead of them, they needed to ensure that he retained enough strength and mental clarity to navigate it safely. But if the route became easier after that point, they could push through the difficult section knowing that the remainder of the evacuation would be manageable. Radio communication with base camp remained sporadic due to the mountain's interference with radio signals, but they were able to maintain intermittent contact with Colonel Bradley, who was coordinating medical support and evacuation logistics from below. Rescue team, this is base camp, came the crackling transmission. Medical team is standing by for immediate treatment upon your arrival. Estimated time to base camp. Klaus checked his watch and consulted with Sarah about the remaining route difficulty. Base camp, estimate 90 minutes to arrival, assuming current pace and no complications. Patient condition stable, but we're managing fatigue and cold exposure. The response from base camp carried good news about weather conditions. Copy that. Weather remains stable, no storm systems approaching. Helicopter evacuation to hospital will be available immediately upon your arrival at base camp. As they continued the descent, Sarah began to see lights from base camp twinkling in the valley below, still distant, but reassuringly real. The sight of those lights marked a psychological turning point in the evacuation, transforming their mission from an abstract struggle against mountain conditions into a concrete journey toward warmth, safety, and medical treatment. Those lights look beautiful, Marcus commented as they paused for a rest break on a stable ledge. I wasn't sure I was going to see anything that beautiful again. The comment reminded Sarah of why she had become involved in this rescue operation in the first place. Beyond the technical challenges and the professional satisfaction of solving a complex problem, this was fundamentally about preserving a human life and reuniting someone with the people who cared about him. Marcus had family, friends, and a life that would continue beyond this mountain because a group of people had refused to accept that a situation was hopeless. The steep descent that Sarah had identified as their final major challenge proved to be just as difficult as she had anticipated. The route required careful rope management and constant communication between team members, with Marcus lowering himself slowly down rock faces that would have been simple obstacles for an uninjured person. Take your time, Klaus encouraged as Marcus worked through a particularly difficult downward movement. There's no rush. Better to be slow and safe than fast and sorry. But there's actually a considerable rush, though Klaus didn't mention it. The temperature was continuing to drop as night settled over the mountain, and prolonged exposure to these conditions would eventually overcome even the best preparation and equipment. They needed to reach base camp before hypothermia became a factor for any team member, injured or otherwise. Sarah found herself constantly monitoring the conditions around them, watching for signs of changing weather or deteriorating visibility that could transform their manageable evacuation into a survival situation. Her experience with mountain photography had taught her to read subtle environmental cues that could provide early warning of dangerous conditions. The route did become significantly easier after they completed the steep descent, just as Sarah had predicted. The final approach to base camp followed gentler ridges and well-established paths that allowed them to move more quickly while maintaining complete safety for Marcus and the rest of the team. I can see individual people at base camp, Pemba announced as they reached a vantage point that provided a clear view of their destination. Maybe 20 more minutes. The relief in his voice was obvious, though none of the team members allowed themselves to relax completely until they were actually back at base camp. Mountain conditions could change rapidly, and evacuations had failed in the final stages when teams became overconfident about their proximity to safety. As they approached base camp, Sarah could see the crowd of people waiting for their return. Medical personnel with stretchers and emergency equipment, rescue coordinators with radios and clipboards, media crews with cameras and lighting equipment, and other climbers who had been following the rescue operation throughout the day. The scene felt surreal after hours of intense focus on technical challenges and life-or-death decisions. The mountain environment that had demanded their complete attention for the past several hours was about to give way to a world of artificial lights, motorized vehicles, and modern medical technology. Marcus, Klaus said as base camp grew larger and more detail below them. You did great up there. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to participate in their own rescue the way you did. Marcus's response revealed both exhaustion and profound gratitude. I couldn't have done it without all of you, especially Sarah, who saw what everyone else missed. I still don't understand how you figured out that route when all those professional rescue teams couldn't find a way to reach me. Sarah considered his question as they made the final approach to base camp. How had she seen what others had missed? Was it luck, preparation, perspective, or was something else entirely? I think it was just a matter of watching instead of acting, she replied. Everyone else was focused on overcoming the obstacles. I was focused on finding a way around them. The medical team took charge of Marcus's care the moment they reached base camp, transferring him to a stretcher and beginning immediate assessment of his injuries and overall condition. After 12 hours of mountain exposure and a complex technical evacuation, he was finally receiving professional medical attention in a controlled environment. Colonel Bradley approached Sarah as the medical team worked on Marcus, his expression combining professional respect with personal amazement. Ms. Nakamura, I owe you an apology. When you first suggested your alternative approach, I thought you were well-intentioned but naive about the realities of mountain rescue. I was wrong. Sarah accepted the acknowledgement gracefully, but her attention remained focused on Marcus, who was now receiving oxygen and warming treatments while paramedics assessed his leg injuries. The important thing is that he's alive and safe, she replied. Everything else is just details. The helicopter evacuation to the nearest hospital proceeded smoothly, with Marcus conscious and stable as he was loaded into the aircraft that would take him to definitive medical care. As the helicopter lifted off into the night sky, its navigation lights disappearing gradually into the darkness, Sarah realized that her role in the rescue operation was complete. The quiet wildlife photographer who had spent the morning planning to document snow leopard behavior had ended the day guiding a technical mountain rescue that saved a stranger's life. The 14th rescue attempt had succeeded where 13 others had failed, not because of superior equipment or greater expertise, but because someone had been watching with patient eyes and had seen possibilities that others had overlooked. The mountain that had defeated 13 professional rescue attempts had finally yielded to an approach that combined technical skill with careful observation, professional expertise with patient study, and conventional rescue techniques with unconventional route finding. Marcus Chun was alive because Sarah Nakamura had spent 7 hours watching instead of acting, seeing instead of doing, and understanding that sometimes the best solution is the one that avoids the problem entirely rather than trying to overcome it through force. 3 days after the rescue, Sarah Nakamura sat in the same spot where she had spent 7 hours watching 13 rescue attempts fail. The supply crate that had served as her observation post was still positioned exactly where it had been during the crisis, but the frantic energy of the rescue operation had been replaced by the normal quiet of a mountain base camp where climbers prepared for routine expeditions and photographers pursued their solitary projects. The morning light revealed details of the cliff face, where Marcus Chun had clung to life for 12 hours, and Sarah found herself studying the route that Klaus had used to reach him. From this distance, the traverse looked impossibly exposed and dangerous, yet she knew that careful planning and professional expertise had made it not just possible, but successful. The contrast between appearance and reality was a reminder of how much perspective mattered in understanding complex problems. Colonel Bradley approached her with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of expression that suggested he had been thinking carefully about something important. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing toward a nearby supply crate that could serve as a makeshift chair. Sarah welcomed the company, though she had been enjoying the quiet morning after 3 days of intense media attention and constant questions about her role in the rescue operation. News crews from multiple countries had descended on base camp, all eager to tell the story of how a wildlife photographer had succeeded where professional rescue teams had failed. "I've been thinking about what happened," Colonel Bradley said as he settled onto the supply crate beside her. "Try to understand why our conventional approaches failed, and why your approach succeeded. It's not just professional curiosity. It's something that could change how we think about mountain rescue operations. Sarah sipped her coffee and considered his question. She had been thinking about the same issues, trying to understand her own role in events that felt almost surreal in retrospect. I think the difference was time and perspective, she said eventually. Your teams were under enormous pressure to act quickly and save Marcus's life. I had the luxury of watching and thinking without the weight of immediate responsibility. Colonel Bradley nodded, but his expression suggested he thought there was more to it than that. Time and perspective are part of it, he agreed, but I think there's something else. Your background prepared you to see things differently than we did. We were thinking like rescuers, focused on overcoming obstacles and applying technical solutions. You were thinking like a naturalist, looking for patterns and alternative pathways. The observation was insightful, and Sarah realized it captured something important about what had happened. Her approach to the rescue problem had been shaped by years of watching animals move through difficult terrain, studying how they avoided dangers rather than confronting them directly, and understanding that the most efficient solutions often appeared to be indirect or counterintuitive. Animals rarely attack problems head-on, she said. They find ways around obstacles, not through them. When I was watching the rescue attempts, I kept thinking that everyone was trying to solve the wrong problem, instead of asking how to overcome the obstacles that made the direct routes impossible. Maybe the question should have been whether there were routes that avoided those obstacles entirely. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a helicopter carrying familiar passengers. Klaus and Pemba had returned to base camp for the first time since the rescue, and they approached Sarah's position with expressions that combined professional respect with personal warmth. "We want to thank you properly," Klaus said as the helicopter noise faded behind them, "and to bring you some news about Marcus." The news was entirely positive. Marcus had undergone successful surgery to repair his broken leg, and doctors expected him to make a complete recovery with no permanent limitations on his climbing activities. More importantly, he had asked Klaus and Pemba to deliver a personal message to Sarah. "He wants you to know that he's planning to return to mountaineering as soon as his leg heals," Pemba explained. "And he's asked if you would be interested in joining him for a climb sometime. He says he'd feel safer on the mountain with someone who sees things that other people miss." The invitation was both flattering and amusing, though Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to transition from wildlife photography to mountain climbing. But the gesture represented something important about how her involvement in the rescue had been perceived by the people whose lives it had affected most directly. As Klaus and Pemba settled in for their own cups of coffee, Sarah found herself at the center of an impromptu gathering that felt like a debriefing session among colleagues who had shared an intense experience. The conversation ranged across technical details of the rescue, lessons learned for future operations, and broader questions about problem-solving approaches in high-stakes situations. What surprised me most, Klaus reflected, was how obvious the solution seemed once we saw it from your perspective. The Eastern approach route wasn't hidden or secret. It was just invisible to us because we were focused on the direct approaches that seemed most logical. Sarah had been thinking about this same issue, trying to understand why experienced professionals had overlooked a route that seemed clear to her after several hours of observation. "I think it was partly because you were thinking about the problem from the perspective of getting to Marcus as quickly as possible," she said. "Speed and efficiency are important in rescue operations, so the direct routes seemed like the obvious choices. But sometimes the fastest route overall is one that seems slower initially because it avoids obstacles that would cause delays or failures later." The discussion continued through the morning, covering topics that range from technical mountain rescue procedures to broader questions about expertise, perspective, and problem-solving approaches. Sarah found herself learning as much as she was teaching, gaining insights into the professional and psychological pressures that shape decision-making during emergency operations. Colonel Bradley had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and He eventually revealed that their discussion was contributing to a formal review of mountain rescue protocols and training procedures. We're developing new guidelines that incorporate some of the observational and route-finding techniques that you used, he explained, not to replace our existing methods, but to supplement them with different approaches to problem assessment. The idea that her involvement in Marcus's rescue might lead to systematic changes in how mountain rescue operations were conducted felt both gratifying and overwhelming. Sarah had never intended to influence professional rescue procedures. She had simply been trying to help save someone's life using the skills and perspective she had developed through years of wildlife photography. As the day progressed, other members of the original rescue operation began arriving at base camp, drawn by news that an informal reunion was taking place. David Rodriguez, Marcus's climbing partner who had been the first to report the accident, joined the gathering with obvious relief and gratitude for everyone who had been involved in the rescue. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if Sarah hadn't been here," David said as the group shared lunch around a makeshift table constructed from supply crates. "Or if she had been focused on her photography work instead of watching the rescue attempts. The timing had to be perfect for everything to work out." But Sarah disagreed with this assessment of timing and luck. "I don't think it was about timing," she said. "I think it was about taking the time to really look at the problem instead of immediately trying to solve it. If someone else had been here with the same background and the same willingness to watch carefully, they probably would have seen the same solution." The conversation gradually shifted toward future plans and the resumption of normal activities. Klaus and Pemba would return to their regular rescue duties in different parts of the world. Colonel Bradley would implement the protocol changes they had discussed and continue coordinating mountain rescue operations across the region. David would eventually return to climbing once he had processed the trauma of nearly losing his partner. And Sarah would return to her wildlife photography project, though she suspected that her experience with the rescue operation would influence her future work in ways she couldn't yet predict. The skills that had enabled her to find an alternative route to Marcus's position were the same skills she used to track animals and understand their behavior patterns, but applying them to human life and death situations had given her a new perspective on the value and broader applicability of careful observation. As evening approached and the informal reunion began to wind down, Sarah found herself alone again on the supply crate, where she had watched 13 rescue attempts fail 3 days earlier. The mountain face where Marcus had been trapped was peaceful and unremarkable in the fading light, showing no signs of the drama that had unfolded there. Her satellite phone rang, interrupting her quiet reflection. The caller was Marcus Chun, speaking from his hospital bed with a voice that sounded stronger and more energetic than when she had last heard it during the evacuation. "Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, "but I wanted to call and thank you personally for what you did. The doctors tell me I'm going to make a complete recovery, and I know that wouldn't have been possible without your intervention." Sarah found herself moved by the call, though she remained uncomfortable with receiving credit for what felt like a team effort. "I'm glad you're doing well," she replied, "but you should know that the rescue succeeded because of everyone's contributions. I just happened to see something that others had missed." Marcus's response revealed that he understood the deeper significance of what had happened. "Maybe that's exactly what made the difference," he said. "Sometimes the most important contribution is seeing what everyone else has overlooked. I've been thinking about that a lot while I've been stuck in this hospital bed." Their conversation continued for several more minutes, covering Marcus's recovery plans, Sarah's photography project, and the possibility of future collaborations between wildlife observation techniques and mountain rescue operations. By the time they said goodbye, Sarah felt a sense of closure about her role in the rescue that had been developing throughout the day. As darkness settled over the mountains, Sarah prepared to return to her tent and her normal routine of processing photographs and planning the next day's research activities. But before leaving her observation post, she took one final look at the cliff face where Marcus Chun had spent 12 hours fighting for his life while 13 rescue attempts failed and one succeeded. The mountain looked exactly the same as it had before the crisis, but Sarah knew that her understanding of it had changed permanently. She had learned that careful observation could be just as valuable as technical expertise, that alternative approaches often succeeded where conventional methods failed, and that the skills developed in one field could prove crucial in completely different situations. The quiet woman who had stepped forward when 13 attempts had failed had returned to her quiet observation of the natural world. But she carried with her the knowledge that watching and seeing, waiting and understanding could sometimes make the difference between life and death for people she had never met but whose lives had been entrusted to her care. The 14th rescue attempt had succeeded not because it was led by the most skilled climbers or equipped with the most advanced technology, but because someone had been watching with patient eyes and had seen what everyone else had missed. In a world that often valued action over observation and speed over careful study, Sarah Nakamura had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply pay attention. The mountain kept its secrets, but it had yielded one of them to a wildlife photographer who understood that the best solutions often came not from confronting obstacles directly, but from finding ways around them that others had never considered. And somewhere in a hospital far below, Marcus Chun was alive to tell the story of how 13 failures had led to one success, and how a quiet woman at 4,000 meters had made all the difference.